Brian was a C-130 aircraft engineer who flew for the U.S. Navy for 20 years and racked up over 300 flights and 4,000 flight hours to, from, but mostly over the continent of Antarctica. During his career down at the South Pole, Brian experienced several highly strange experiences, including seeing firsthand a giant entrance to an underground base area in the middle of a no-fly zone. He encountered and shuttled a team of scientists who completely disappeared from their isolated camp for over 10 days. When Brian and his team recovered this group, every single one of the scientists was in complete shock and nearly catatonic after some unknown traumatic event. Brian also witnessed shiny discs flying in formation and pacing his plane over the trans-Antarctic mountains twice in one trip. After each of his incidents, Brian and his crewmates were straight up told, if not threatened, to keep quiet and that these incidents never happened. By the time he retired from his duties at the South Pole, Brian, his flight crew members, as well as other experienced flight crews, were all convinced there was and is something extraordinary going on and being hidden down in Antarctica. Brian entered the U.S. Navy in 1977 and became a first-class Navy flight engineer aboard Lockheed C-130 Hercules cargo planes. He began flying down in Antarctica in 1984 and returned every year until the 96-97 season. During this time in the Navy, Brian and his crews were always based out of McMurdo Station in western Antarctica. This is about a 3-hour flight from the South Pole, which was a nearly daily route flown by Brian and his crew. From the South Pole to another 3.5 to 4-hour flight to Davis Station on the eastern edge of the Antarctic continent. In the 1984-85 season, Brian was getting ready for a standard flight mission to resupply a science group out on the western Antarctic ice sheet. Before departure, the crew was informed of a change of mission order where they'd actually be flying across the Davis Station in East Antarctica for a medevac emergency pickup. This new plan would take them to the South Pole, then continue across the continent to Davis for the medevac. While at the South Pole, Brian's flight navigator got instruction for their flight path that would have them deviate about 20 miles around a no-fly zone that was directly between them and Davis Station. This area is designated a no-fly zone because in that area, there's an air sampling station. However, the most direct route is directly over this no-fly zone. Once airborne, and because of the nature of the emergency at Davis, it was decided together by the crew that instead of deviating the 20 miles, they would in fact take a route directly over and through the no-fly zone. Also important to note along this route from South Pole towards Davis, there weren't any other science camps or stations out on the ice in that direction at all. About 5 to 10 minutes into this direct route, one of the crew members was looking down from their position and noticed something odd out the window. Down below them, at about a 45-degree angle, they saw something that didn't make sense. A large, ramp-like opening going down into the ice. And even at 20,000 feet in the air, they could tell it was huge. Staring out the window, Brian and his crewmates could tell the opening was roughly the size of a football field, or about 300 feet in diameter. Their approximate 45-degree angle position overhead was such that they could definitely make out subduction of what seemed to be a ramp. Whatever it was, they thought it was definitely big enough to drive or fly an aircraft directly into it. Something else also caught Brian and his crew's eyes that wasn't supposed to be there. Vehicle track lines in the snow leading from the pole directly out towards the opening. Again, odd because there wasn't supposed to be anything out there in this area. Whatever it was in the bright snow, they could definitely tell there was vehicle tracks leading to this huge, stark anomaly, a giant opening going down into the ice. 4 hours later, Brian and his C-130 crew arrive at Davis Station to pick up the emergency evac patient. On the way back to South Pole from Davis, the crew was again intending to take the most direct route back through the no-fly zone. As they were cruising at about 35,000 feet and about 25 miles out from where they had seen the opening, they received explicit instructions from the South Pole controller to reroute away from the no-fly zone. This order took them on a course well away from where they had seen the opening. Brian said it was not possible to get a second look at the opening as they were now about 20 to 25 miles away from its location. Once they were well past this no-fly zone, they were then ordered back on direct course to South Pole. After a quick stop at South Pole, where they refueled, they were quickly back up in the air. Arriving back at McMurdo, the crew prepped their standard post-flight routine. However, in this instance, they were told to wait at a different location instead of the normal operations area for their debrief. The whole crew was taken to a different conference room in a separate building. Soon after the crew sat down, an unknown officer entered the room, took off his jacket, took a seat, and stared at each of them for a few moments without saying a word. Then, after making eye contact with all crew members, this unknown officer said abruptly, "What you saw today, you did not see. You were not over that area, and you will not ever talk about this incident again." And that was it. He stood up, put on his jacket, and walked out of the conference room. No threats, no NDAs were signed, just an oddly stern order from an unknown high-ranking officer whom they didn't recognize to never discuss what they had supposedly seen that day. Brian said the whole thing was odd, and because they were focused first and foremost on the mission and the emergency with their patient on board, they didn't even really think the whole experience was actually that big of a deal and figured it was maybe just some secret area or weird optical anomaly. Still, Brian and his crew didn't think it was anything of too much importance at the time. Months later, during other stops at South Pole, Brian and his crewmates were hanging out and talking at a local pub when they overheard an odd conversation between some civilian scientists talking about the air sampling station. They overheard them say they were heading out there soon to talk and interact with the visitors. Not to talk to a specific scientist like Dr. So-and-so or Professor So-and-so. They had specifically referred to whomever they were going to talk to as the visitors. A third crew corroborated this as well. Eventually, after these crews had swapped stories about what they had heard, they all deduced that there was indeed an under-ice facility out there, and that the impression that these crews got, that whoever these visitors were, they weren't normal people, or maybe even human. After this exciting start that Brian had to his career, the most significant event of high strangeness wouldn't come for another 10 seasons later. First, it's important to understand that the C-130 flight crews are assigned to specific science party or military groups that they drop off or put in. That specific flight crew will then be that group's specific transport in to bring them any additional supplies they need, and they are their exit transport out after the mission is over or terminated. This protocol is in place for several reasons, but largely because of the vast distances, harsh conditions, and limited landmarks of one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. The original flight crew will have the exact coordinates, notes, and familiarity to best service and help that specific group versus any other crew who wouldn't have this level of familiarity. Around mid-October 1995, Brian's crew got an order that they would be putting in a science camp of about 15 people. The mission included delivering the team and all their equipment, all their snowmobiles, housing, fuel, food, etc. On the day of the scheduled mission, the team of scientists were dropped at the foothills of a small range of mountains in an area called Marie Birdland and would be out there for a period of 4 weeks. The camp wasn't very far, only about an hour and a half, hour and 45-minute flight out from McMurdo to where the camp was. After being dropped off, these isolated temporary research camps and science teams are required to check in every day over HF radio back to McMurdo. For the first week or so, everything was standard procedure. The teams were staying in touch and everything was going to plan. Then, around the week and a half mark, communication back to McMurdo suddenly stopped. After 2 full days with no communication, safety procedures dictate a flight by the C-130 crew back out to the camp to see if there are any issues with communication equipment, any loss of power, lack of fuel, a medical emergency, or whatever may have caused the loss of contact. Being the ones assigned to the missing science team, Brian and his crew were ordered to fly back out to check on the camp of scientists. And this is where it starts to get pretty weird and definitely a little creepy. Brian's C-130 crew came in low, as usual, to fly a few circles around the camp. From the air, they could clearly see the camp was still there, buildings were all intact, snowmobiles were there, but they didn't see any movement or signs of any people. Besides the huts and snowmobiles, the whole place looked empty from above. So they landed the plane, shut down the engines because they didn't know how long they were going to be there, and to have a look around. They walked up and down, checking huts, looking in every single one and every corner they could find. Brian's team located the HF radio, fired it up, made contact back with McMurdo right away. Clearly, a faulty radio wasn't to blame here. They counted the snowmobiles, none were missing, and they didn't see any tracks that led away from the camp out into the snow that they could see. In fact, the only thing out of the ordinary here was that there were no people around, nor were there any signs of where they could have gone. Brian jokes that they were half expecting to find bodies or something, but there was just nothing. Creepy. After a thorough examination of the camp and failing to locate anyone, the crew had no choice but to fire up their plane and head back out to McMurdo. On their way out, they flew sector coordination circles to search for any sign of the team, starting in tight arcs around the camp and winding out into larger and larger loops to a range of about 15 miles in all directions. But still, nothing. After returning to McMurdo, Brian and his crew went through their standard post-flight wind down, and that was it. That is, until about a week later, McMurdo received a radio call from the camp out of nowhere. Wait, it wasn't horror movie sounds coming across the radio. Although from this story so far, you wouldn't be surprised. No, it was the team of scientists who had gone missing, and they were requesting immediate evacuation. So forget the last 3 weeks of them disappearing and then reappearing. Another really unusual thing happening in the situation here, these scientists only had stayed for 3 weeks of their allotted 4-week trip. Scientists who put in the tremendous effort of getting support and funding for a research mission down to a place like Antarctica are going to spend every last minute they have down there. Brian confirms this, saying scientists are usually trying to stay till literally the very last minute of their allotted time because it may be the only trip they ever get to do in their career or lifetime to the continent. With contact reestablished, Brian and his crew fly back out to the camp to pick up the scientists. When they land and they pull up, all the scientists' camp and equipment was packed up on pallets and ready to go. Now, procedure here is that usually the cargo gets loaded first and then the passengers. But as soon as the loadmaster dropped the C-130's aft loading ramp door, the science crew couldn't get on the plane fast enough, even before the cargo. They all rushed in, sat down in their seats, and then were staring at the ground between their feet. Brian and his crew thought this was odd, but okay. So they finished loading the equipment and pushed off back to McMurdo. Once they were airborne, the loadmaster was trying to offer food and coffee to the scientists, but none of them would take anything. In fact, no one would talk to, look at, or even acknowledge him. The loadmaster then called Brian back for assistance. When Brian got back to where everyone was seated, his loadmaster said, "I don't know what's going on here, but none of these people will talk to me." Brian looked around and noticed that all of them were either looking down at the floor between their feet or they had this weird, terrified look on their faces. Brian noticed one of the scientists who was watching him and his loadmaster walking around, so he went up to the guy and asked him, "Hey, where were you guys? What happened to you out there?" Brian got nothing but a frightened, blank stare back. None of them, out of 15 or so people who had just gone missing for over a week, would answer a question or even say a single word. Super weird. And then when they landed back at McMurdo, the scientists wouldn't get off the plane and had to actually be shuffled off by the loadmaster. Brian says the science crew appeared to be in some state of shock, like they had PTSD or something. Something or someone had scared these people so badly that they were basically catatonic. After finally getting them off the plane and unloading it, you'd think that might be the end of this thriller movie-like scenario. And you'd be wrong. After arrival back to McMurdo, all the shell-shocked scientists were immediately loaded onto another aircraft that was there waiting for them. Brian said the only thing they knew about the science team departure was that the plane that retrieved them was headed straight back to Christchurch, New Zealand. And from there, they never heard anything about what happened to that team of scientists ever again. Back on the ground at McMurdo, all the gear from the science camp was immediately taken into a separate building and quarantined. No one was allowed to go inside where the equipment was, and everyone was told specifically, do not go near it. This is despite that space in and around Antarctic facilities is always at a premium. So to Brian, it was again odd that nothing else was allowed to be stored in the building with the cargo and gear from the missing scientist camp. The equipment stayed under strict quarantine for a week. Another cargo plane and crew under special mission orders came into McMurdo from Christchurch specifically to retrieve the equipment and returned it back to Christchurch on an otherwise empty aircraft. This too was odd because of the logistics of operating on the Antarctic continent. Cargo planes don't just fly back and forth from Christchurch mostly empty. Nearly every time, planes are loaded to the hilt before making transitory trips back to New Zealand. However, this giant cargo plane was sent over to retrieve the quarantine load and was mostly empty on the way back, with nothing besides the scientist camp equipment on board. After arriving back at McMurdo with the scientists that day of the retrieval, Brian's crew performed their post-flight wrap-up but were told to attend a special debriefing in a separate area of an operations building. This actually turned out to be the exact same room that Brian and his former crew had been in about 10 years earlier when they were debriefed when they saw the giant opening in the ice. This time, however, instead of a military officer coming in for a stern debrief, two gentlemen showed up, not wearing military fatigues, but wearing black suits. The men took off their jackets, sat down, stared intently at each of Brian and his crewmates for a few minutes in total silence. Finally, one of them asked bluntly about the retrieval flight back with the scientists. So, no one talked to you, right? Brian's loadmaster asked them, how did you know that? The first gentleman replied, we just know. Short story shorter, Brian's crew was again told not to say anything about this incident. Not that the scientists had gone missing the first time, not that they were catatonic and unresponsive on the flight back, not that their equipment had been quarantined. They were all told specifically this was a non-event. Again, no one signed an NDA, and in Brian's opinion, this was because, similar to before, they wanted to give the impression that the whole thing was just not a big deal. Just forget about it and move on. However, it didn't take long for Brian and his crew to find quiet corners to chat and exchange stories with other flight crews. In fact, another crew told a very similar story, but even more bizarre, of going out to retrieve a different science team, but this time they had left the entire camp's equipment behind out on the ice, which was really weird because as the crew that took them out to the location for the initial drop, they knew that it had a ton of expensive science measurement equipment. And obviously it's not standard procedure to leave anything out there on the ice. This isn't actually uncommon to hear weird stories about Antarctica. Ask anyone who's spent any significant amount of time down there, and they will tend to agree with Brian and most of these crew stories that there was and is something weird going on down at South Pole. The case of the missing and reappearing catatonic team of scientists, in my opinion, is the most interesting to highlight that there is in fact something really weird happening down on the continent of Antarctica. However, this next encounter Brian had is yet another piece of compelling evidence for the existence of UFOs at the South Pole and on this planet. It was the very next season after the missing scientists, and Brian was again flying with the same crew from his previous season. So with just a normal mission in front of them, Brian and crew left McMurdo and headed to the east side of the Transantarctic Mountains towards South Pole. Not long into the flight and cruising at over 25,000 feet, Brian's loadmaster noticed something weird out the window. He saw glints of light reflecting off some small but very shiny round objects flying along the tops of the range. He called Brian over to take a look. Out the window of their C-130, they together witnessed a group of about 4 to 5 disc-shaped craft flying in formation over the Transantarctic Mountains below them. They watched out the window as the formation of discs played kind of follow the leader, darting from one mountain top to the other extremely quickly. Then, for some time, the discs actually paced the plane as they continued on their track towards the South Pole. Eventually, the Transantarctic Mountains start to come to an end and sort of fade off to the west slightly. While Brian and his crew stayed on course and further away from the range, the discs continued to pace the plane but stayed over the mountain range and eventually fell out of sight. After completing their quick stop at South Pole, the crew turned around and made their way back towards McMurdo. Once they got back to that same area around the Beardsmore Glacier and the Transantarctics, the crew once again noticed the same bright, shiny disc pacing their plane. So, according to Brian, he believes that they definitely saw UFOs, or at the very least some extremely advanced disc-shaped craft at the South Pole. Brian and his crew had been through odd experiences before, so this time, other than hushed conversations with other crews, after having their previous experiences of being told to keep quiet, Brian's team never told anyone about these sightings. No notes, no radio calls, nothing anywhere on record that they had seen any sort of UFO type disc or craft. Similar to the episode with Navy Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet, I'll leave a link below to that video. Here is yet another example of why servicemen and women are afraid and encouraged not to report or talk about these things. Our pilots and crew members are the most highly trained professionals. They know when they see something weird, something different, and they need to be encouraged to report these incidents instead of being fearful of repercussions from misguided ranks who threaten them. After 20 years as a Navy flight engineer and experiencing firsthand many highly strange and puzzling events, Brian left the Antarctic continent with the personal conviction that something was and is going on at the bottom of the earth beyond what we are told. Brian flew his last Antarctic flights in the season of 1996 to 97. He's since been retired from service for nearly 20 years, and he thought the weird incidents related to his encounters were over. But in June 2016, Brian met up with Linda Moulton Howe for dinner one night before an event that kicked off in Joshua Tree, California. Linda was interested in his story and wanted to chat in person with Brian. After dinner, they finished the conversation outside under a tree and talked until nearly 12:30 that night. Eventually, they said goodnight and departed with nothing substantial happening in that moment. It should be noted, this meeting happened before the event, so if anyone was tracking or listening in, it was planned from before the event. After the event that happened over that weekend, where Brian had attended simply as a spectator, he flew home that Sunday to start back to work on Monday. While at work that next Monday morning, he received an interesting, if not terrifying, phone call on his personal cell phone. Important to note here, Brian works in the aerospace industry that requires him to maintain a security clearance. He doesn't have an outside phone line to his office, and it's very rare for him to receive any calls related to work. At around 10 a.m. that Monday morning, Brian's personal cell phone rang and he picked it up. Hello? The male voice on the other end said, "Hello, is this Brian?" "Yes, who's this?" The reply back was straight to the point. "There are some people who know you've been talking about certain things and are kind of upset about this. They'd prefer you didn't talk to anyone anymore about those things." Confused as to what this person was referring to, Brian asked for clarification and said, "Sorry, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Then this anomalous voice on the other line said, "Well, we know that you had dinner this past Thursday with your nephew and Linda Moulton Howe at that restaurant in Joshua Tree, California, and that you were all out in the parking lot until about 12:30 in the morning talking." Slightly taken aback, Brian says, "Oh yeah? And how do they know that?" Person on the line answered, "What we do is we pretty much know everything that goes on. Brian replies, "Oh, really?" And the voice says, "The people I'm associated with really don't want you talking anymore about the missing scientist you encountered down in Antarctica." Brian then asks, "How do you know about that?" The voice again says, "We pretty much know everything. So stop talking." And click, they hung up. Slightly in shock, but sharp enough to realize the number popped up on his cell phone, Brian looked up the number. It came back as the general number for the NSA in Fort Meade, Maryland. It was then that Brian realized that he was being surveilled by someone at the NSA. Talking with Linda about this later, she asked Brian if he had any concerns about possible repercussions. Brian quickly replied that he will never back off from telling his truth to these experiences. Which, good for you, Brian. As anyone who feels fearful of speaking their truth, you shouldn't. The gatekeepers maintain their power by using shady, veiled threats. The reality is, they can't keep everyone quiet anymore. And we need to remember they're operating illegally when they try to scare people. Because as law-abiding citizens protected by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we have a First Amendment right to a freedom of speech. However, some intelligence agencies and agents clearly don't play by the rules and believe they are above the law. So what is Brian's ultimate take on all this? When he reflects back on his experiences and interactions over his career, including the failed attempt by a random person from the NSA to keep him quiet, it all points to and reinforces the belief that there has been and is a presence of something or someone down in Antarctica, and that they, whoever they are, have been there for a very long time. Unfortunately, the intelligence and government insiders have decided that we as a species can't handle and don't have the right to know the truth. As I've said before, that's total BS. Nothing makes any one human more physically capable of handling any particular information or truth more than any other. Just as it may have been a shock for them to learn for the first time, they got over it, they accepted the paradigm change, and moved forward with their life. This would be the same for the vast majority of the population. We as humans are all the same. We are all one, and we can all handle the truth just as well as any gatekeeping person or group did initially. And if you're a gatekeeper, you don't have the right. You're not in the right, and you're not doing the right thing for our species or our planet. But you know what? Truth and love are immutable laws of the universe, and the truth will be known, as will your actions of suppression someday. And maybe gatekeeper actions are indeed necessary. Maybe they indeed have genuine excuses. But as Ron Burgundy famously said, and I think he speaks for most of humanity when he does, I don't believe you. Because as it seems, if the gatekeepers of this secret are scrambling to cover their asses for the fraud of hiding this greatest story in human history for over at least 80 to 90 years, and if that is indeed the actual case, then you are not patriots. You are traitors against your own species. I hope you enjoyed this episode about the beyond strange events that are being encountered by our service members down on the Antarctic continent on a regular basis. Shout out to Lynn and Moulton Howe, who originally interviewed Brian on her Earth Files podcast. If you are curious about Brian or skeptical of his story, I highly recommend you go listen to the full interview where Brian and Linda talk about all these stories openly for nearly 2 hours. If you're someone who has spent any amount of time either on expedition or in the service down at the South Pole, then please share your story in the comments below. Or if you'd like to share your experience more directly on a Beyond Strangeness episode, then get in contact with me through my website, beyondstrangeness.com. Most importantly, if you think this story and others like it need to be heard by more people, then please subscribe and share this video. Doing that will help signal to YouTube that it's important and that it should be shown to more people on the platform. It really does help tremendously. And if you would like to support this channel directly then please consider becoming a member of the Beyond Strangeness Patreon. You get early access to episodes, exclusive access to me to talk about future episodes or whatever you like, swag, and all support goes directly towards accelerating the frequency of these uploads. And if you'd like to see another video about the strange and wild UFO-based technology patents submitted by the US Navy, then watch the episode linked below and at the end of this video. And until that next episode, thank you for watching. My name is Jason. This has been Beyond Strangeness. I'll see you again soon. Take care, my friend.